Okay, hey everyone, and welcome to the first video in regards to UpTheStack. It starts with the application. Now, there's two areas of UpTheStack that I firstly want to kind of touch on. First is the project itself, and that's the reason for the video. Is the project is around the CNCF landscape, and we're going to take a look at some of the projects, the why, and some of the building blocks around that as part of the introduction. But equally, this is going to become the website or the site in which I post relevant information around the cloud native ecosystem and all of that good stuff. So, without further ado, let's jump into it. So, from an introduction point of view, the project is designed to share information around projects that we see within the CNCF landscape that are both graduated and incubating. Why are we doing it? Well, we all know the CNCF landscape. Lots of people in the community have taken a look at it. It looks very overwhelming, or can look very overwhelming when you start looking into it. There's obviously a lot of open source projects that are focused on different areas of that cloud native ecosystem. Not everything needs to be Kubernetes, for example. Some are stretched out into different areas of cloud and cloud native workloads. It's not just Kubernetes. So how can we how can we uncomplicate that? How can we take the graduated and incubated, because that gives us a handful of projects that is manageable. Like, it's not 1,000 projects for starters. It's actually, at the time of recording, is around 55, and we're just going to go, and I'll touch on it, but we're just looking at those 55 projects, both in video format as well as maybe a little bit of written content as well. But the key point of this is that it's going to provide some sort of structure and breakdown to that landscape without being massively overwhelmed with all the different new logos that you may or may not be familiar with. Okay, so before we get into that, who am I and why should you even consider listening? So I'm Michael Cade. I'm a field CTO, global field CTO at Veeam Software, and one of the companies, or one of the acquisitions that I look after mostly within Veeam, is the Kasten K10, or the Kasten by Veeam product, which is more focused around Kubernetes backup, and that's really where it's going to stay. I'm not gonna really be talking about anything to do with the employer. You can find me on the Twitters mostly at Michael Cade1. I also started a project a couple of years ago called 90 Days of DevOps, which has grown and grown over the last couple of years. You can see a QR code there. Take a look at it. And it's kind of the same premise as what we see with this project, is that, so 90 Days of DevOps was, as it says, let's take 90 days and we're going to look over the principles, processes, and some of the tooling and scenarios where DevOps can be used. And we take 7 days on each of the topics, and we get a good understanding over those with some hands-on and some what's the big picture of those. I'm a HashiCorp ambassador. Big fan of what they're doing from an open source point of view, but also from an enterprise perspective. And I'm also an ambassador for Open UK. So open source is another big thing in my wheelhouse. And I would say, actually, I'm a huge advocate for open source learning more than anything. Okay, so this session, what are we going to cover in this? And really the key part of this project is I want to keep these short and sharp in regards to what we cover. So firstly, I want to touch on the CNCF overview. What is the Cloud Native Computing Foundation? What is the landscape? What are the projects that we're going to be talking about? And then a bit of a breakdown around that. Okay, so if we think about the CNCF, and now we're going above the landscape here. So the Cloud Native Computing Foundation is the open source vendor neutral hub of cloud native computing, hosting projects like Kubernetes and Prometheus, two very well-known projects in there, to make cloud native universal and sustainable. And that's their quote. That's what they thrive and strive to be. And this is the landscape that I'm talking about. So if you were to go to the landscape website, if you just do a CNCF landscape, you'll get to the landscape URL. I haven't got a link here. But you'll see here that there's a lot. There's a lot going on, both in each of these blocks, but then there's a hell of a lot of logos that, depending on where you've come from, that I should have mentioned that as well, is I very much come from the operations side. And I feel like a lot of operations people are inheriting a lot of cloud native, whether it be a Kubernetes cluster, whether it be a Kubernetes or a platform that leverages Kubernetes. We're inheriting a lot of that stuff. It's no longer just a developer landscape here. We're also thinking about the operations side as well. This is overwhelming, and it starts to get a little bit tedious in terms of, well, how the hell do I know what to pick, what to choose, and how to go about that? So the goal of the cloud native landscape, and again, this is from the CNCF, is to compile and organize all cloud native open source projects and proprietary products into categories, providing an overview of the current ecosystem. Okay, that is great. I'm a massive fan of what the CNCF does from an open source perspective, and the engagement that we have, the options, the freedom of choice that we have is amazing. The opportunity that we have as well around open source, as well as there's I'm not going to go into all the details because there's proprietary software and companies and vendors on the landscape as well. We're not going to be covering them as part of UpTheStack. Cast and K10 is one of those. We don't need to get into that. What we are going to do is we're going to break down those categories. You'll see the coloured items or the blocks, and we're going to start by at the bottom there around provisioning, and we're going to work our way up, and then we're going to move over to that observability and analysis. But you can see already, if we just untick, and there's a key on the left hand side of the landscape, and you can just go, right, I just want to look at graduating and incubating projects. I don't need to see everything. And already here you can start to see, okay, these are the building blocks that we can start to build a bit of a system, a bit of a platform around what we're trying to achieve. And we're going to take a look at these projects that you see on here. Okay, so provisioning, and what I'm basically talking about here is the bottom layer. So as if we're building a house, a foundation, we need to start by provisioning our workloads. We need to start thinking about what that automation and configuration, and that first section is provisioning. So that as a category, and a lot of this is taken from the CNCF glossary. I'm just reducing that down so that we don't have to go through pages and pages of documentation. So tools that are used to create and harden the foundation on which our cloud native apps are built. Okay, so we have to, if we're going to run cloud native applications, we generally need to provision something so that we can do that, whether that be roll your own environment or leverage a managed service. And within provisioning, we have some groups of different areas. So where you saw provisioning being that bottom whole category, then within that we see subsections of that. So firstly, around automation and configuration, codifying the environment setup, it becomes reproducible with the click of a button. So in there, we might be thinking about infrastructure as code to provision the actual environment that we want to use. If we're thinking about Kubernetes, that might be how do we build our Kubernetes cluster. Container registry, storing all container images in one place. They are easily accessible for any developer working on that application. Security and compliance, obviously a big thing. From day zero, we should be considering security and compliance, especially in this day and age. Containers must be scanned for known vulnerabilities and signed to ensure they haven't been tampered with. Finally, in this provisioning category, we have key management, securely distribute secrets and keys, or a service specification related to authentication or authorization, or both. Okay, so then we move up to the next layer. Okay, how do we start building our house? We need some sort of runtime. So everything a container needs to run in a cloud native environment. So within that runtime, we have three areas: cloud native storage, and this is something very close to my heart, and this is how do we provide cloud native storage options for our containers. And when we get into that and the projects around that, we're going to then potentially start looking at the state, no pun intended, in fact 100% pun intended, the cloud native storage options that we have so that we can run our data services, which I'll get to later on as well. Then we need a container runtime, launches apps in a standardized fashion across all environments and sets security boundaries for our applications. Cloud native network, how do they communicate to each other? Networking functionalities to containerized applications. Okay, then we move up. How do we then manage this? How do we orchestrate and manage this? Tooling to handle running and connecting your cloud native applications. Okay, so a few more buckets here, if you will. So scheduling and orchestration, container orchestrations, automate container management. That's obviously where Kubernetes lands in there. Coordination and service discovery. The location of everything is constantly changing. Service discovery tools address this problem. Remote procedure call, highly opinionated way of handling communication between services. Service proxy, proxies act as gatekeepers between the user and services or between different services. API gateway acts as a go-between that takes the messages requests from the user and forwards them to the appropriate service. Service mesh, reliability, observability, and security features uniformly across all services on a platform layer without touching the application code. Okay, then we move up again. So, okay, how do we guardrail? How do we put those app definition and development in place? Tools that enable engineers to actually build the application. So within there, this is where we start thinking about things like data services. Databases provide a common interface for applications to store and retrieve data. Streaming and messaging, again, still leverages some sort of data. Services need to communicate with one another and keep each other in the loop. App definitions and image build. So developer-focused tools to build your applications, but then from an ops-focused point of view, how do we standardize that? How do we keep it under one roof as best as possible? Continuous integration and delivery. Ensure that any code change or updates are built, validated, and integrated with other changes automatically and continuously. And then, if you remember, we're moving over to the right-hand side now around observability and analysis. To ensure there is no service disruption, you'll need to observe and analyze every aspect of your application so every anomaly gets detected and rectified right away. Okay, so a couple of links after this as well. So first of all, in the sections within this, or the groups or the buckets, I can't think about what I'm going to call that yet. We have monitoring. Good monitoring allows operators to respond quickly. We have logging, helps teams diagnose issues and meet regulatory and compliance requirements. We have tracing. Debugging that tool allows you to troubleshoot and fine-tune the behavior of a distributed application. And chaos engineering. A little bit strange that one landed in there, but we'll get to that later on down the line. Intentionally introducing faults into a system in order to test its resilience. I guess it does make sense. So finally, where do I start from a cloud native landscape point of view? I said about a link to that overwhelming landscape. Go and have a look. I'm sure if you're landed on this anyway, that you're somewhat into that landscape and you've probably just put it to one side. You're aware of it, you know, some of the projects, but what we're going to do here is we're going to start building that house, or building that up from the foundation up. And then a link to UpTheStack. So UpTheStack being a repository, this is where you're going to find a GitHub Pages website where we're going to have some written content, some walkthrough stuff, as well as links to these videos that are appropriate to those 55 projects that we have. And depending on the health of the project, we might start looking at some of the serverless stuff over in that serverless bit. But for now, that's a little bit out of scope. So if we were to take those 55 projects, you can see them all here represented. So all of these are open source. All of these have been donated to the CNCF or to the Cloud Native Computing Foundation as projects that are maintained generally either from an open source perspective by a community or by bigger companies and several companies at that. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on that foundation, and we're going to start taking a look at some of these projects as we walk through it. Okay, and with that is very much the length of time that I want to be looking at from a from a video perspective. So whether it be looking at one of these, I only really want to spend 15 minutes. I want to understand what purpose does it serve? How do we use it? In terms of, okay, let's get hands on. So I'll run through some demos, and maybe a bit of like, what is it? How does it work? Why do we need it? Just to kind of shine a light on some of these, because so I've been working in this space for the last 3 years, and I'm very much, Kubernetes. You can see front and center. That's probably where I've spent most of my time. But we know that we each pull in some of these on a daily basis. Helm to deploy our application, etcd to store our key value pair, our database, our configuration values within Kubernetes. But it's obviously a project on its own as well that can be used outside of Kubernetes. It's not just a Kubernetes project. I've done some work around Open Policy Agent. I've done some things around Prometheus as well. Also covered that within the 90 Days of DevOps project. But before I actually dive into any of it, hopefully that's a good introduction to the project, and look forward to spending some time with everyone, and sharing some of this, as well as my own learning journey. Some of these logos are very new to me, so we'll be learning together. With that, thanks for watching.